Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years.
Thank you for inviting me to come to talk to your branch today. So I'm currently a visiting lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, where I obtained my PhD in 2021. So my PhD thesis, which then this talk kind of draws partly from, was an analysis of the everyday lives of the English working class between the years 1900 and 1945. And I explored this topic through the lens of 50 unpublished working class autobiographies, essentially letting these individuals' memories, experiences and anecdotes not only speak for themselves, but also guide my research based on what was most notable to them. So I just wanted to begin this talk by giving you a little bit of background information then about the autobiographies that I used, both in the thesis and then of course in today's talk. So autobiographies to me as a historian are an invaluable resource, as they are the recollections of individuals who lived through the period of history that we are attempting to understand. And these are not the autobiographical reminiscences of famous or notable individuals. Those stories have already been told, but these are individuals who just wanted to record their life for prosperity. And of the 50 life histories, I managed to obtain a near equal split between male and female voices. So I had 24 male autobiographers and 26 female autobiographers. They were all born in different locations throughout England, and they were born between the years 1900 and 1915. And the year of their birth was quite important because I wanted to kind of explore what it was like to be kind of a child in one war and then an adult in a second. And they also then had to include, very importantly, recollections of the First World War in their account. So the autobiographers submitted their autobiographies to an archive that was collected by social historians John Burnett, David Vincent and David Mayall in the 1980s. And a requirement of entry was that the individuals had to self-identify as working class. The autobiographies could vary in length, style and formality. And there was really no kind of minimum standard for literary kind of requirements, so that meant that nobody was ruled out based on their kind of grammar or their spelling or anything like that. In my sample, for example, one of the autobiographies is just a series of kind of letters, and one has no punctuation at all, which made it very interesting to kind of follow. Now, these autobiographies, of course, don't represent every experience in England during this time, but they did reveal a wide variety of experiences that are often excluded or absent from historiography. And the point then of my research and the talk today is to suggest that if such stories exist in this kind of small sample, how many other stories of everyday life during the first half of the 20th century and the First World War remain hidden or untold because they don't fit with the narrative that historians have been telling. So, when I began my research, I was particularly interested in what it was like to be a child during a conflict so famously associated with loss. And for me, a conflict summed up by the propaganda poster, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" In this poster, we see that the young girl is questioning what role her father played in the war, whilst her brother plays very pointedly with soldiers on the floor. The audience knows that the daughter expects her father to tell her that he was involved in fighting or that he fought in the conflict. Any kind of answer to the contrary would be almost unpatriotic, hence the look of potential guilt or concern on the father's face. As such, when I began looking into memories of the war, I thought the question, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" would be answered then through the children's experiences of absence, loss, or death. However, what I quickly realised was that experiences of the war, wartime service, and family life on the home front were more nuanced and varied than I had originally anticipated. So my talk today will cover 3 areas. It will begin by looking at death in the First World War. It will then move on to discuss the wartime activities of the autobiographers' fathers, before concluding with analysis of the impact of the war on the autobiographers' family life. So this is a quote taken from James Chandler Newton's autobiography. James was born in 1912 in North London. James recalled that his father joined the 7th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in 1915. He later wrote that, "A tragedy befell our family in August 1918, when my father was killed in action at Belleville Woods in Flanders." So when I began my research, his was the sort of story that I expected to be typical amongst the autobiographical sample. And my assumption was really based upon the fact that death is the lasting legacy of the First World War. This is understandable. It's been estimated that around 722,782 British men died during the First World War. And as Pat Jarlin notes in her book, Death in War and Peace, the First World War forced a shift as people suddenly had to face violent mass death. Yet, whilst no one would deny that many British men lost their lives, I quickly realised that the war did not claim the life of every man who served, nor did every man in Britain serve in the war. Yet the understandable focus on death and suffering in commemoration and historical accounts of the First World War has obscured then other experiences of the conflict and life on the English home front. As Jay Winter notes in his work, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, public commemorations and war memorials have fixed the narrative of death into contemporary British culture because death is the central message that they convey. Indeed, so pervasive with death in the post-war rhetoric that in the aftermath of the war, he says, there were very few Britons who could look back without thinking of the dead. This preoccupation then with servicemen's experiences has also filtered into discussions on childhood and juvenile experiences of the war. Historians have regularly placed the absent or killed serviceman father at the centre of children's experiences of the First World War. For example, Richard van Eemden's work focuses solely on the 400,000 children who lost their father during the conflict. Similarly, Rosie Kennedy's discussion of wartime childhood also explores the relationship between children and their absent serviceman father. However, the autobiographies considered here offer a different insight into the prevalence of death during the war. Theirs are stories in which death was not the central experience. And this is because of the 50 individuals whose stories were studied, James Challenger Newton was the only writer amongst the sample who actually lost their father as a result of the First World War. This was then a much lower kind of paternal mortality rate than I had initially expected. And then the first section of my talk will then kind of indicate the reasons that the mortality rates were so low amongst this sample. Firstly, what quickly became apparent was that not all of the autobiographers actually had a living paternal figure by the time the war broke out. Whilst the First World War is, as I say, kind of associated overwhelmingly with death, civilian health actually started to improve due to a variety of factors, one being increased kind of disposable income, and the fact that the war eliminated kind of some of the worst features of urban poverty. After 1915, death rates due to infectious diseases in the population began to drop, and there was also a slight decline in maternal mortality rates. Winter also argues that the mortality rates then for working class men declined during the war, so the totals of wartime deaths were actually lower than they would have been without the war. Indeed, for this group of individuals, the war was actually a period of decreasing mortality, as more of the individuals lost a parent to infectious disease in the pre-war period than they did to any other cause during the entirety of the conflict. Before the war, the start of the 20th century really was a period of very high mortality and short life expectancy for the working class. The average life expectancy in the 1900s was 46 for men and 50 for women. And this was really caused by, as I say, infectious diseases, poor nutrition, but also heavy labour. So 6 of the autobiographers had already lost their father to infectious disease before the start of the war. Guy Oates' father died of influenza because he refused to take any time off work. Elsie Finney's father died of consumption, which she described as a kind of weak chest, but that's likely what it was. Another father, Himmy Fagans, died of consumption, one of enteric fever, one of rheumatic fever, and one father died in an unspecified cause, slightly an infection because he doesn't mention kind of any sort of accident befalling him. So both Henrietta Birkin and Charles Hansford mothers actually remarried. So they had a stepfather figure by the time the war broke out. However, the remaining 4 other mothers remained widows. And as such, the high mortality rate for working class men meant that only 46 of the 50 autobiographers had a living father or stepfather figure when the war broke out in 1914. Another reason for the kind of low incidence of war-related paternal mortality amongst the sample was due to the fact that of these kind of 46 fathers or stepfathers, only 13 actually had their father absent from the home engaged in military service. And as I say, of those 13, only one father was killed in action. The survival rate, therefore, of the fathers enlisted was around 92%. And it became quite apparent that there were a variety of reasons to explain why there was a high survival rate amongst these enlisted fathers. Firstly, their age likely played a part. Although the exact age of the fathers was not always possible to ascertain from the autobiographers, they normally just reference like father and mother, they were likely over 25. And research conducted by Dan Todman demonstrated that the mortality rate for men in service was highest amongst men below that age. 1 in 7 of the male population under 25 was killed, in comparison to 1 in 10 men aged between 25 and 40, and this then dropped to 1 in 20 if the men were aged 40 or above. Age then was not the only factor influencing their kind of chance of survival. So too did the location of their military service. Statistically speaking, men deployed to France or Flanders were the most likely to be killed. For every 9 men sent to these fronts, 5 were killed, wounded or missing, a much higher figure then than any of the other combat zones. Whilst again, the deployment area of their fathers is not always explicitly stated by the 13 autobiographers, it was clear that the majority were not in France or Flanders. Fred Baxter's stepfather, for example, served in Palestine. Kay Garrett's father was in Egypt. Bessie Wallace's father was invalided out of the army with tuberculosis after the Gallipoli campaign. Of the 13 autobiographers with a father in military service then, only 5 explicitly stated that their father served in France or Flanders. And these were Joe Airy, Florence Cooter, Nellie Driver, Sid Metcalf, and perhaps unsurprisingly, James Challenger Newton, as James' father was the only one to be killed, and he was fighting in Flanders. The length of service then, of course, also made a difference. Cyril Smith's father was discharged from the war after developing a disease in his eye before he was actually even posted abroad. As such, there was very little chance that he would then be killed in actual combat. The final kind of mitigating factor that can explain the kind of low mortality rate amongst the fathers in service was the position in the military that their father held. May Rayner's father remained in England working in various hospitals as a cook after being enlisted into the Royal Medical Corps, and as such was unlikely to face much in the way of mortal danger unless his cooking was particularly bad. So, although this talk is focusing on fathers during the First World War, I thought it was important to note that whilst the impact of losing a father during the war has received significant academic attention, the impact of losing a sibling has not. Leonore Davidoff notes that, quote, "It was parents, sweethearts, wives and children who received the lion's share of attention." However, given the age range of fertilities, it was more likely that these individuals would lose a brother than a father during the war. Here we have an image taken from Guy Oates's autobiography. 3 of his siblings, Trafford, Aubrey and Russell, 2 of whom are pictured here at the front, enlisted into military service. Fortunately for Guy's families, all 3 brothers survived the war. Guy, however, was one of 9 of the 50 autobiographers who wrote of at least one of their brothers enlisting. Of these 9, 4 lost at least one brother. As such, amongst this sample in particular, it was brothers, not fathers, who had the highest probability of being killed, accurately kind of reflecting then the high mortality rate of servicemen under 25 during the First World War. Notably though, and perhaps slightly influenced by the absence of kind of mourning siblings from post-war discourses, the autobiographers did not draw upon the kind of common post-war themes to recall the loss of their sibling. There are no references to kind of wasted youth, sacrifice, duty or honour. Rather, their reminiscences suggest that the wartime context of their sibling's death was secondary really to the premature ending of that relationship. This is an example from Harry Dorrell, who was born in London in 1903, and he was one of 7 children. He was 11 years old at the start of the war when 2 of his brothers enlisted into military service. Whilst one of his brothers survived the conflict, his other brother, Alfie, died shortly after the armistice when he tragically slipped and fell from a naval ship. The sudden loss of his brother clearly caused Harry great anguish, but he makes little mention of the war, and there's really no themes of heroism or duty, and they're certainly then not used as any consolation in his grief. He wrote, "A sense of isolation surrounded me, not comprehending, not believing, but knowing it was true. I should never see my Alfie again, never see him again. I did not cry, I stayed silent." That being said, the high incidence of sibling deaths on active military service among the autobiographers should not be exaggerated. 5 mentioned their brother returning home after the war, and the rest of the autobiographers had no sibling involved in the conflict. All of this is not to say, of course, that references to death during the First World War were completely absent from the other autobiographers with no immediate family member in the conflict. However, any other references to loss or death during the war seem to be almost anecdotal, included as a way of justifying almost their version of the conflict and linking their experiences back to this collective memory of loss. Gertrude Freeman was born at the turn of the century in Birmingham, and she included the story of the death of 2 cousins, both of whom we saw very occasionally, who were killed in the early days of the war. Her description of their death appears almost journalistic, as she explained that they were killed due to the distinctive officer uniforms which made them easily spotted by snipers, concluding that this was soon rectified and all the men indistinguishable, but alas, too late for Alec and Leonard. Kathleen Betterton was only 2 when the war broke out, and she suggested that it was her young age during the war, which meant that death did not really affect her. She wrote, "I was too young to feel frightened, and far too young to feel any deep sorrow when father's dearly loved younger brother went away to France and never came back." The blasé nature of such recollections suggested that the deaths were not profoundly upsetting, particularly as they were not immediate family members. And then this is further evidenced by Stanley Rice's autobiographical recollections. So Stanley was born in 1905, and aside from James, who lost his father, and the 4 who lost a brother, Stanley was the only other autobiographer to explicitly include a wartime death that they stated to have upset them. He wrote of the death of his favourite Uncle Bill, stating, "When the news came through that he had been killed, I remember crying like a baby." However, his grief was still not the dominant memory of war, which instead focused on memories of his grandfather, play, and his part-time job. Moreover, he still emphasised that his immediate family were lucky and came through the war without damage. Overall, 45 of the autobiographers included no recollection of an immediate family member being killed in the First World War as a result of their war service. Now, you might argue that this sample was just particularly fortunate, but that doesn't really appear to be the case. In his book, The Great War, Dan Todman also concluded through a statistical analysis that overall, only about 1 in 9 households lost a man to the war, and about 1 in 6 lost a member of the immediate family group. Furthermore, whilst to say there is a cultural collective focus on death as the lasting legacy of the war, it was simply not the dominant experience for the majority of these autobiographers. This then raised the question of what was Daddy then doing during the Great War? And why was he not in military service? Whilst the common assumption is that England was devoid of men during the war, some 42% of Scottish, Welsh and English men, adult male population of military service, remained on the home front as civilians. The majority of the autobiographers' fathers then formed a significant part of this significant minority. Although, as I've already noted, obviously 13 fathers were absent because of their war service, 33, including some of the stepfathers, remained on the home front. And this was then despite any propaganda calls which encouraged them to enlist, and of course despite the eventual introduction of conscription. And so it appears that for the majority of the autobiographers' fathers, they could not, they would not, or they didn't have to join up and leave their families. So to start off with, the Military Service Act, which was passed in January 1916, only required single men to enlist for service. But of course, that eventually stopped being voluntary. In May 1916, the Act was extended to also include married men. But despite the introduction of conscription, these 33 fathers remained civilians. And so I wanted to figure out why that was. So although the autobiographers do not always explicitly state the reason for their father's exemption, it's possible to kind of deduce the grounds on which they obtained exemption. And it was not due to kind of any sort of conscientious objection, as you might assume. There's only really one recollection of conscientious objection at all, and it's actually Cyril Smith when he's an adult, and he's stating he had anti-war opinions during the Second World War, and he did consider objecting to his conscription based on grounds of conscience, but decided that the title of conscientious objector didn't really kind of fully reflect his beliefs. He wrote that, in early 1940, I was prepared to be a conscientious objector, but of course my objections were political, not matters of conscience. So instead, exemption from service during the First World War was likely then to have been due to a combination of factors, including occupation, health, and age, rather than any sort of objection to the war. So the most common ground for exemption would have been their employment. Whilst it is well established that many women took over certain roles during the war to free up men to fight, there was still a range of occupations in which the current employees were deemed vital, and as such, men of eligible military service age could be granted exemption if their job was listed as a protected occupation. Now, the protected occupation list did change quite often during the war, but information published in 1916, 1917 and 1918 included the occupations that 15 of these fathers were employed in. So I've just got a few examples. Percy Vere's father was a flour miller, and excluding those engaged in trucking, sack filling or packing, men working in flour mills were exempted from service. Edna Bould's father was also exempt, partly because he was a baker, but also because he suffered from ill health. Now, bakers were exempt from service, providing they baked bread and not fancies, small bread or confectionery. So how many suddenly decided to ditch the cakes and start making bread isn't written down, sadly. But she wrote that one of the most bloody and terrible wars made little impact on our family. Our elders were never conscripted into the army. Our elders were in reserved occupations or unfit for service. The children too young to be involved. My father was called before military tribunals. The days of the tribunal, when his case for exemption would be considered, were days of fear and apprehension for the family. Various physical defects and his profession invariably swung the case in his favour. He would come home smiling and exempted. Henrietta Birkin's stepfather was also exempt. She wrote, "Dad was exempt as he knew where all the electrical cables were laid in the West End, having helped to lay most of them. But he was given a badge to wear in his lapel to say that he was exempt." Likewise, Hilda Salisbury recalled that father was a marine engineer and draftsman. He was not called up, but he worked non-stop night and day through the war years. Charles Hansford's stepfather also moved kind of temporarily into a protected occupation during the war. He was a bricklayer, and this was a trade that wasn't in of itself kind of protected. But Charles recalled that his stepfather had taken the opportunity of switching to munition making as building operations tailed off. For a couple of months, he worked in an annealing foundry, a reserved occupation, which exempted him from conscription. Charles then also noted his mother's frustration as his stepfather decided to leave that employment, presumably because she was worried that he would then be conscripted. He wrote, "To mother's consternation, ennui soon set in. He left to resume his travels. Fortunately, he escaped being called up." In addition to the 15 fathers in protected occupations, a final 16th managed to avoid service through a kind of combination of their employment, relocation, and a little bit of luck. Jack McCoyd's father was a commercial traveller who sourced fruit and jam. Jack wrote that my father's age group was coming up for conscription. Working in the food line might possibly get my father a few months' remission from being called up, but he knew in his heart he would have to go in the end. To ensure his family's welfare in his absence, they all went to stay with family in Ireland. However, the war ended before he was called up. The combination of his father's employment, his age, and a bit of luck, whilst moving, was enough to ensure that Jack's father remained exempt from service. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, another reason for exemption was age. By analysing the autobiographers' descriptions of their fathers and the very occasional reference to birth dates, they're not very handy and helpful including those all the time, it was possible to identify 3 in particular of the 33 fathers who would have been automatically being exempt, specifically due to their age. So these three fathers were over the upper age limit for conscription of 41. And this is a limit that remained in place until the last few months of the war, when a new Military Service Act raised it to 51. But this change made no difference to kind of any of the exemption status of the fathers. Gertrude Freeman's father was one such man. She wrote that, "We were very fortunate in our family, having no near relations of military age. Father was much too old, so we did not have to see any of the family go." Some men were also simply too unhealthy for military service. Jay Winter reminds us that the appallingly low standards of health in many urban working class districts probably saved the lives of many industrial workers. Like the Boer War before it, the First World War highlighted the very poor physiques of the English working class. 10% of the British men medically examined between 1917 and 1918 were deemed completely unfit for service. It's not surprising, therefore, that 7 of the autobiographer's fathers were exempted on medical grounds. Harry Young recalled that his father suffered from chronic lifelong ill health due to childhood starvation. But his rejection from the military due to his health became a bit of a family joke. Harry wrote that when his father was called up to undertake his medical examination, that the sight of his father undressed petrified the doctor, who ordered him to get dressed and go home at once. This was the source of great merriment and laughter to family and friends, with my father joining ruefully in with the joke. Kathleen Betterton also recalled her father's disappointment when he was unable to enlist in the army as a result of having suffered from rheumatic fever as a child. She wrote, "My father remained at home, having been to his mortification rejected for the army as medically unfit." Her father then also didn't forget this feeling of rejection, and during the Second World War, Kathleen recalled that he walked the streets during air raids and refused to leave London. She wrote, "This time it was his war, and he was not going to miss his share in it." The medical exemption of one of the fathers was also a kind of case of tragic irony. Eva Holland's father was one of the estimated 2,886 civilians injured in the aerial bombardment of the English home front during the war. He was working for the railway, driving a horse and cart, but his occupation was clearly not deemed vital to the war effort, and he was called up for his medical examination in June 1917. He was being examined on board a train at Liverpool Street Station when a German plane bombed it. His examining physician was killed instantly, and Eva's father was left disabled as the explosion damaged both of his legs. At the very moment that her father was in all likelihood being past fit for military service, he was then mutilated as a result of it. Surprisingly, though, 7 of the autobiographers offer no specific information as to why their father was exempt from war service, nor did they really kind of mention his age, health, or even particularly what his occupation was. But these fathers do appear to have been at home, present at home, as they are mentioned as being there when they're recalling the war. And of course, they don't state that they were absent. For example, Wally Ward in his autobiography included an incident in which a Zeppelin raid burnt down a local factory, resulting in his father being unemployed once more. Ernest Martin also included an anecdote concerning food shortages that indicated his father was still at home. In a rather morbidly humorous recollection, he wrote that in 1918, he and his brother had a pet rabbit each. Eventually, father offered a shilling each for them. Little did we realise why, until that weekend when there was rabbit pie on the menu. Whilst it is likely that these fathers were then exempted for one or more of the reasons already discussed, the lack of explanation offered by these writers, even when reflecting on their wartime childhood, suggests that a father remaining on the home front was not so common that they felt it needed to be justified. In fact, of the 33 authors whose father or stepfather remained on the home front, only Henrietta Birkin recalled her father actually wearing an item that signalled his exemption. Only Edna Bold wrote of her father having to attend a tribunal. And Kathleen Betterton is the only autobiographer who recalled that her father actually had any desire to volunteer for service, although he was found to be medically unfit. So the lack of explanation or defence of their father's civilian status throughout the war suggests that they do not feel he should have enlisted. The autobiographies indicate no concern over their father's inability to undertake his kind of patriotic duty. Instead, the conspicuous absence of any defence suggests that exemption was more common than collective memory might imply, and that father's presence on the home front was by no means abnormal. So, having discussed the lack of paternal mortality during the conflict and the various reasons that the majority of the autobiographers' fathers remained at home, I wanted to conclude this talk then by discussing how these various war-related situations actually impacted on the family lives of the autobiographers during the conflict. So it makes sense to begin with the only story then, which was also an end. James Challenger Newton reflected on the death of his father, stating, "Being too young, we didn't realise what this meant for our mother with 3 young children to rear on her own. A war widow's pension of £2, 11 shillings and 2 pennies a week was awarded to mother, and this must have meant a hard struggle for her to provide food, clothing and shelter for the 4 of us." James's focus then is not so much on the kind of sudden or unnecessary loss of his father in wartime, but on the financial impact of his death on their family. And this is notable because it speaks to wider working class financial issues, as well as the reliance on the paternal breadwinning figure. In fact, even within my wider thesis, the focus on the financial implications of the death of a father in their childhood was very often commented upon by the autobiographers. But, as I have noted throughout this talk, experiences of paternal death were the exception. But experiences of paternal wartime absence were comparatively much more frequent. Jay Winter also argues that wartime separation tore families apart. He maintains that nothing could have reversed completely this tide of separation and loss. And whilst it's likely that many family relationships were indeed fundamentally altered, the autobiographical recollections examined here suggest that not all wartime absences were remembered as traumatising, and that family bonds were kind of quickly re-established. Despite Winter's bleak analysis, these autobiographies suggest that responses to wartime separation varied depending, more often than not, on each individual family circumstances. And there are again a variety of different factors that would have reduced the stress caused by separation, including the length of separation and the age of the autobiographer when the absence occurred. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the wartime absences that were most distressing for the families were the cases in which the fate of a loved one was unknown. Florence Cooter was born in Surrey in 1912, and she was one of 9 children. And she was 6 years old when her father left to serve in France in the army. Florence recalled that her mother had received a telegram concerning her husband in 1918. And her mother tried, a little unsuccessfully, to shelter the younger children from the report that their father was missing, presumed dead. So whilst Florence was unaware of the exact circumstances, she noted her concern for her mother, writing, "During this time, I remember my dear mother was very sad and worried, once putting a shovel of coal in the saucepan, which was on the hob, instead of on the fire." The fears understandably caused by the telegram were luckily dispelled when, one day, my dad walked in. No wonder my dear mother fainted with relief and shock. Whilst the return of a father was nearly always a cause for celebration, for children, the return of their absent father, both during and after the conflict, could initially cause distress or confusion. As Florence had only been 2 years old at the start of the war when her father enlisted into the army, she was then unaccustomed to his presence, and when he returned home on leave, she found the kind of return of a stranger confusing and terrifying. She wrote, "I remembered it so well because I was so terrified when I saw this man in clothes I had not seen before, with leather patches across his chest. He picked me up and threw me up in the air and kissed me so hard I just cried and ran into the corner. My father crying and saying, 'My God, my own children don't know me.'" Despite her initial fears, Florence was still able to build a relationship with him when he eventually returned home at the end of the war. And the strength and closeness of this relationship are evidenced by the inclusion of various stories and anecdotes of the time spent with him. Nellie Driver was only a few years old when her father left for 4 years to serve in the Royal Field Artillery in France, and she had a similar experience. She wrote of her fear when a strange man appeared in their home. "I first remember him as a dark, handsome man in khaki, who on one of his rare leaves from the front advanced on me with open arms as I played on some spare ground by our home. I rushed screaming indoors, but soon I had conquered my fears and sat on his knee. And when he had to return to France, I would not be consoled. So the return of a father on leave may at times been a little bit scary for some of the children, but it was generally a cause for celebration. Even more so when it ensured that the family was provided with extra rations. Joe Airy's father and brother were enlisted into the army, and he noted that things were different when Dad and brother Oliver were on leave. They would go to the shops with us and there was no waiting in line, and when they walked into a shop, they got 3 times the rations we were allowed. Of course, not all servicemen fathers were separated from their families for the entire duration of the war. The nature and location of their service, combined with the relative ease with which the working class could move from rented property to rented property, could help reduce the length of their wartime separation. May Rayner's father, who I mentioned earlier, remained in England when he was in the Royal Army Medical Corps, a result of him having flat feet. He ended up working in the hospital as a cook and was later posted to Salisbury Plain. The family were then able to relocate to be near him. May wrote that, after a month or 2 of separation, my mother decided to put the home into store and go to Wiltshire to be near my father. Cyril Smith had a similar short period of separation from his father. In his autobiography, he really notes the kind of close relationship that he and his father shared. As such, he recalled vividly that his father was absent on 2 occasions during the war. Firstly, when he was engaged in war work in Drayton, and later when he was called up to join the Norfolk Regiment. This period of service only lasted a few months. He was the one that was medically discharged after developing a disease of the eye. Fortunately for his family then, the temporary and short nature of these absences meant that they did not alter the close relationship that Cyril had with his father. The separation was, of course, important enough to be noted by Cyril, but it was so short-lived that it didn't have any sort of lasting impact. The ability, however, to build or rebuild a relationship after a wartime separation varied depending on the personality of both the father and the child. Sid Metcalfe was born in London in 1910, and he would have been around 4 years old when his father left for service. Even as a young child, Sid noted that he had kind of a difficult relationship with his father, and it wasn't really necessarily eased by his absence and his subsequent return from the front. He described how his father had made it so clear that he had no time for me that I eventually grew to fear him. Despite his lack of warmth towards him, Sid still believed that his father's return home after he was invalided out of the army with trench fever and shrapnel wounds would help unite his family. As, in her husband's absence, his mother had been spending time away from the family, meeting with other men. Sid wrote that, somehow, although he never showed any great feeling for me, it was good to have him back. The house took on more the atmosphere of a home with both a mother and a father present. Although he was no longer considered fit to serve in any capacity whatsoever, to my uncritical eyes, he was just the same as when he left. He was my dad. He was the very foundation upon which our whole family rested, or so he seemed to me. His hopes for a harmonious family life were to prove misplaced. And he wrote, "For my mother now had formed habits she found quite impossible to break." He had little doubt that the blame lay with what he saw as his mother's shortcomings as a wife and mother. He wrote, "Her love of the outside world was now her master, and her infidelities continued." Sid described how his mother would also bait his father into fights with other men, until eventually he went around the corner to do battle and didn't come back. He had had enough. He didn't even bother to pick up his things. He had left home. After his father abandoned the family, things did not improve for Sid. His mother's time at home became more sporadic until, after a very short space of time, she disappeared altogether. And to this day, not one of us known what were the circumstances that caused her to go. We assume that she is dead. While Sid's relationship with his father was altered by his wartime absence, it was not the war that was to blame, but rather his parents' inability to nurture a relationship with him and ultimately their decision to leave. Sid's mother's adultery, though, does speak to wider social concerns that many wives were committing adultery whilst their husband was absent. Such concerns were not unfounded, as both illegitimacy and divorce rates increased during the war. Yet one of the autobiographies suggests that adultery in wartime was not uniquely a serviceman's cliché. So Hilda Salisbury was born in Bolton in 1901 and was around the age of 13 when the war broke out. Her father was exempt from service as he was the marine engineer and draftsman. Yet whilst he remained on the home front, the demands of his war work meant that we, his 4 children, seldom saw him. His wife she felt neglected and found it hard to accept the situation. Hilda believed that it was her father's wartime employment that was to then be blamed for the breakdown of their family. She felt that they had not fared any better than the families of servicemen who were forced to leave their homes, writing, "Our family life was as shattered as if he had been in the trenches in France." Again, in his kind of absence, Hilda's mother, like Sid's, had the opportunity to spend time then with other men. And she was a singer, and she would often entertain the soldiers that were on leave. Hilda described her as a gay, lovely, restless creature always laughing. One night, in the aftermath of a party, Hilda saw her mother sitting on a soldier's lap, crying and kissing him. And it later transpired that they were then having an affair. A few days later, when she returned from school, Hilda found that her mother had gone. A note for her father simply read, "I can't stand it any longer. I'm leaving you for good." So wartime absence then clearly had an impact on both the behaviour of Sid and Hilda's mothers. But again, it's worth noting that the war didn't actually cause their family breakdown. Sid's account stressed that his mother's behaviour continued despite his father being back, eventually driving him away. And she then decided to abandon the family after the war. Likewise, whilst Hilda blamed her mother's affair on her father's absence whilst he was working, it was again not the war that caused a permanent absence. It was her mother who chose to run away from the family, and it was then her father who decided that she was not allowed to come back even after she apologised. Notwithstanding these 2 cases though, family separation and family breakdown caused as a direct result of wartime absences were rare amongst the sample. Now then to turn to the experiences of the majority of the sample. These are the stories of the families who remained together during the war. So of course, not all families may have actually benefited from their father's exemption from service. Sadly, a father remaining at home did not guarantee a happy childhood. Harry Young had a difficult relationship with his father, who could be on occasion very violent towards him. He also believed his father to be an incompetent businessman and argued that his father's rejection from military service on medical grounds did more to hinder his family than help it. He wrote that his father's rejection was actually a further misfortune. As if he had been drafted into the army, my mother and I would have taken over the business, which, by this time, due to the war, had become a potential goldmine of scarce second-hand bicycles. My father continuing in control was a certain guarantee for hopeless failure and disaster. This, of course, though, had much more to do with kind of the individual relationship between Harry and his father. Unfortunately, such unhappy experiences were far less frequently recorded in these autobiographies. But that does not mean then that no other families shared a similar sort of sentiment. However, for the majority of the sample, because their family remained together with their father at home, the war did not have such a destructive effect or worrying impact on their lives. As such, they tended to focus on a variety of different aspects of the conflict. For some, the war even brought with it certain benefits. Samuel Montford was born in 1907 in Birmingham, and he was one of 7 children born to a tailor. Samuel recorded in his autobiography that the war represented a turning point for his family because it created new employment opportunities for his father. His father's change in occupation from a very poorly paid tailor to a timekeeper in a munitions factory meant that for the first time in his life, his family had sufficient income. Samuel recalled that his father was awarded wages beyond all dreams, around £5 per week. The home was improved, debts paid off, clothes for us all, a different standard of living in all respects. All through those stormy days and nights, our family was a happy one. So with the majority of their families remaining together, for some the war became just a background event. Edna Bold wrote in her autobiography that, with our father safe and secure at home, the war ceased to exist for us. Everything about the war seemed fictional, spurious compared with the reality of the grind at school and home. For others, with their family safely together, the war actually broke up the monotonous routine at home. Emily Gertrude was 14 when the war broke out, and she wrote that, "I must admit I was very excited over the upheaval it caused in our quiet ways." While she also recalls the more trying aspects of the war, such as rationing, she predominantly felt that even with all these trials, life didn't seem so monotonous. So as the autobiographers' childhoods were not characterised by separation and loss for the most part, their memories tended to suggest that the biggest issue they faced as a consequence of the war then related to food. For these individuals, wartime sacrifice was really measured in terms of food shortages. Samuel Montford, whose family now had more disposable income thanks to his father's new employment, also recalled that he spent a lot of his childhood during the war in queues by trying to purchase food for his family. He wrote how the war had really got hold of things and food was getting short in the shops and long queues everywhere. Likewise, Ernest Martin had a similar experience in Manchester. He recalled the rush to the shops when goods were delivered, with men queuing for their smokes, women borrowing babies so that they were allowed to get to the front of the queue on sympathy, or taking one or more of their own children and telling them to pretend not to be the family so they could get more of the goods. When not recalling the kind of inconvenience of rationing, they also recalled the aspects of the war that they kind of found to be exciting, such as Zeppelin raids. Kathleen Betterton recalled that, "If anything for me, the war added to the gaiety of life. Air raids provided Hilda, her friend, and me our happiest diversions. In the morning on our way to school, we hunted for bits of shrapnel and we would swap stories of the night's doings like any grown-ups." Kathleen's memory was predominantly then of childish excitement. She recalled that during the raids how Hilda and I wanted everyone to play Ring of Roses. After all, I argued, if we're all in a ring, there'll be plenty of room for a bomb to fall in the middle. For Kathleen and her friend, those nights held for the two of us all the fun of midnight picnics, and my hopeful question, as I was tucked up in bed, was always, do you think there'll be an air raid? The detritus left by the raids further then added to this kind of spectacular and playful nature of the attacks. Kathleen described how, in the morning on our way to school, we hunted for bits of shrapnel to pass from hand to hand round the class. Stanley Rice also experienced similar childish excitement when collecting bits of metal left over after the raids. He recalled how we as youngsters found it great fun digging up all sorts of bits of metal. To us, it was always shrapnel. So in conclusion then, the answer to the question, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War, is not a straightforward one. For 13 fathers in the sample, the answer was that they were absent from home, fighting for their country. Luckily for 12 of these families, these men also survived their time in military service. And as a result, for most of these 50 individuals, death was then not the lasting legacy of the First World War. And whilst the absence of their father could be distressing, particularly if they did not know where or how he was, these families still managed to rebond and carry on as a family unit upon his return, notwithstanding kind of Sid Metcalf's father and mother's experience. Moreover, for the vast majority of the autobiographical families, the answer appears to be carried on as usual, with the majority of these families continuing on in their day-to-day activities despite the war. What's more is there is little suggestion in these memories that it was unusual for their father to remain on the home front, despite what the poster would suggest. Their father remaining at home was not a result, as I mentioned, of conscientious objection to the war, but was due to a variety of factors, including age, ill health, or occupation. As a result, their father remained a visible part of the autobiography's experiences of a wartime childhood. For these children, with their family remaining together, the war could be exciting, mundane, and sometimes tedious, but it was definitely not defined by personal experiences of paternal absence or death. Thank you.